Hello, everyone, and welcome. And another day in the neighborhood, right? So, this is going to kind of be where the going gets especially tough, right? That we already saw earlier, kind of the strained relations between the colonists and the British. And this is where it's going to take up a whole other another notch and is going to start to get even more of a dangerous situation here in the colony. So, storm clouds approaching. It's kind of the name of today's lecture. So, leaders in the Massachusetts Assembly, led primarily by Samuel Adams, who you may be familiar with, the beer. Hopefully, you're not drinking a lot of beer, but you've seen the beer anyways. Okay, he's actually the cousin of John Adams. Okay, and Samuel Adams is much more kind of extreme even than his brother is. He's a kind of ardent son of liberty, very serious about kind of leading this movement to break away from England. He's going to start to he and Massachusetts Assembly are going to start to circulate letters to these other colonies asking for a united front. So it's almost a little communications network they're setting up. And they're trying to secretly send these letters because they're aware the British are maybe trying to intercept them. So they're kind of secretly letters saying, hey, let's get together. Let's try to form some sort of a united front against Britain, because it's going to mean more if all the various colonies step up and are kind of tough against Britain. If it's just one or two colonies, not going to be so tough. But if we all kind of pitch in and have a united front against them, maybe we're going to have a better shot at kind of protesting them. Here's a picture of Samuel Adams. Okay. Naturally, the British, they have spies and they have people who are loyalists as well, who are going to kind of rat them out, basically. They're going to tell them, hey, you need to stop doing this. And they're going to say no. They refuse to do this. They're saying, no, this is our right to do this. And what are you going to do? You got to make us stop. We're not going to do it on our own. Okay. So this actually forces England to get more serious, and they actually step up and say, you know what, Massachusetts Assembly, we're just going to tell you to dissolve, meaning you have to just get rid of your assembly. You're not having any sort of local or colonial government anymore. This is a pretty drastic step, because now all of a sudden England is getting in the way of these colonial democratic governments from conducting business. And they're stepping up and saying, nope, absolutely not. You need to shut it down because we don't want to have to deal with this. Okay, so that's a massive step. Them telling the Massachusetts Assembly, Massachusetts kind of colonial Congress, hey, you need to step down and change things. Okay, Boston, New York, and Philadelphia. Of course, Boston's in Massachusetts. New York is in New York. Philadelphia is in Pennsylvania. Obviously, outside of Massachusetts, well, Boston's in Massachusetts, but all those are kind of these individual little cities. And in protest of what happened to the Massachusetts Assembly, they all step up and sign non-importation agreements, meaning that we're not going to have anything imported from Britain is not going to be allowed here. This is also a massive step, because they're saying, hey, listen, if you're not going to recognize our democratic governments here in the colonies, then we're just not going to even import any goods from England. Naturally, this is going to be a kind of a pretty drastic step that's going to really hurt imports over in England. So that's going to be a pretty serious move for them to make. Okay. In Virginia, also, again, Virginia, massively influential colony, they're going to pass an important thing known as the Virginia Resolves, which says only Virginians can only be taxed by the House of Burgesses. So they're basically saying only the House of Burgesses can tax Virginians. Parliament, all you folks across the way in England, you cannot tax Virginians. That's basically them putting their foot down, saying, hey, if you're not going to respect all these other territories and you're not going to respect us as Virginians, then we're not even going to pay these taxes. Similarly, Britain, they dissolved the Massachusetts Assembly, they're going to dissolve the House of Burgesses. And Britain understands kind of what a severe thing this is, because so many of the leaders of this growing discontent and this growing movement of colonials are based out of Massachusetts and based out of Virginia. So to dissolve them is a pretty big step, because they're saying, listen, we know that a lot of important, influential leaders are coming out of here. So it's a way to try to tamper down and tame them. But if you know anything about us Americans, obviously, we don't like to be told what to do, and we don't like to be tampered down and tamed, right? Because that's just actually going to make the colonists even more angry, because they're getting rid of these democratic governments here in the colonies, again, in Virginia and in Massachusetts. So they try to actually lower the temperature of the colonists, but naturally, it's only going to raise it even further. So how are the colonists going to start to fight back a little bit? Well, boycotts and protests gained popularity all throughout the colonies, right? Like those non-importation agreements that were saying we're not going to import any British goods. A lot of colonists are going to start to say, well, we're just not going to buy any in ourselves in an individual way. So some of these colonies were kind of making actual legislation saying we're not importing goods. Others are just going to kind of protest and boycott on their own. Okay, so what does that mean? Stop buying British tea, stop buying British cloth. And so naturally, that has kind of some pretty drastic impacts on Great Britain, and in Great Britain's business is going to start to take a tumble as well. Also, you have the Daughters of Liberty. That's going to be kind of a more woman-based group, like the Sons of Liberty, kind of were more male. Daughters of Liberty, more female. And they're going to make homespun clothing because a lot of the best clothes they usually bought from Britain. So if they're not buying British cloth, then they're going to have to start making their own. So they're going to, Daughters of Liberty saying, we're going to make patriotic clothing, meaning it's clothing made here in the Americas. That's going to be kind of a huge selling point. And a lot of people, it's going to become a source of pride and patriotism, right? That I'm buying here in America. Similar now, like, made in the USA, made in America. People take pride in that. Same thing was going on back then, that we're not, instead of buying from China like we would do now, they're saying at that time, we're not buying from Britain and we're going to make our own things here. We don't need Britain to buy all these things from. We can make them here in the colonies. And naturally, as I said, this comes a source of pride and patriotism. The Sons of Liberty are going to start to step up and go a little even more further than that. They're going to really encourage lots of boycotts, but they're also going to start to kind of intimidate tax officials and colonial businesses that are buying maybe from Britain. They're going to kind of come in there, intimidate them, and say, no, you need to buy from here in America. So Sons of Liberty are getting a little bit more and more drastic, and we're going to talk about the most drastic thing they do kind of into this. But they're getting more and more drastic and more serious about, hey, we're going to do whatever it takes to make sure that, business is being made here in the colonies and we're not benefiting the British. Naturally, as a result of all that, there's going to start to be a sharp decline in imports from Britain. So Britain's economy is starting to hurt because less Americans are buying from Britain and more buying here from the things produced in the Americas. Okay. So tensions are naturally getting hotter and hotter. Okay. And it really kind of reaches its tipping point when more and more violence is starting to be perpetrated against custom officers at Boston is at an all-time high. And those custom officers were usually people, and some of them were born in the Americas, some of them were from Britain, but oftentimes they were born here in the Americas just doing their job. And these custom duty officials were basically, in sort of thinking like this way, the tax collectors who were basically going around and these merchants and these people selling stuff kind of on the docks or in cities and saying, hey, you got to pay your taxes. You got to make sure you're paying the king. And people started naturally getting violent against these people. So that's going to, be a problem. Again, many of these people were simply doing their jobs. They didn't even, some of them didn't even really love Britain all that much themselves, but they were just doing their jobs, and people are going to abuse and attack some of these people. About 1,000 troops are going to be sent to the city of Boston to defend these officials. And again, Boston is really the hotbed for so much of this radicalism at the time. Okay, again, the Sons of Liberty are based in Boston. Boston is, again, in the Northeast, the largest port. So a lot of money's going in and out of this city. So Britain sends 1,000 troops there to try to tamper down on it a little bit. Okay, on the very fateful day of March 5th, 1770, crowds are going to start taunting this particular customs house in Boston. And kind of might be funny to think about now, kind of a common refrain or a common thing they would shout at these British people, or these British soldiers, were lobster backs. And they wore these red coats, the British soldiers did, and they looked red, obviously, so say, hey, you lobster backs, or whatever they were saying, to them. So they were really taunting these people. So that actually prompted more troops to be brought in, okay? Now, what exactly the order of this happened is still up for debate. But what is known is these, for one thing, we do know these soldiers were outnumbered trying to protect this customs house, okay? And also, it's Boston, and it's kind of early in the year, still winter, so there was snow on the ground. So it is also believed that a lot of these kind of colonists were maybe making snowballs, putting rocks in the snowballs, and throwing them at these poor soldiers, right? So these soldiers, they're scared, they're anxious, it's cold out, They're getting attacked by snowballs that have rocks. It's not exactly known who shot first, if there was somebody in the colonist side who had a pistol or a musket and maybe fired a shot off. Regardless, a sound happened, and that just prompts the troops to get scared, and they just start shooting into the crowd. Okay, 5 are going to die, 6 are wounded. Okay, so no British troops die in this, but 5 of the colonists die as a result of this, 6 wounded. Okay, I mentioned this for those in the class when we watched the video about this a little bit. Really, a lot of people consider the first bona fide casualty of the American Revolution is this guy right here, Crispus Attucks, okay? And what's very notable about this is Crispus Attucks was himself an African American, a black man, okay? So even from the very beginning, and again, the official American Revolution won't start for another few years, but we're getting closer and closer to it. Crispus Attucks, like I said, African American. From the very beginning, African Americans are playing a massive role. He himself was protesting there, and it wasn't believed he was being violent at all. He was just in the crowd when the shots started firing, and he unfortunately lost his life, okay? So again, I put massacre in quotes. 1 person dying would be awful enough, okay? So don't get me wrong. 5 people dying, yeah, that is bad. Don't get me wrong. But this started to be called the Boston Massacre. Now, I don't know about you, but when I think of the word massacre, I'm thinking of dozens of people maybe, unfortunately, losing their lives, okay? And again, 1 would be too many. 5 is certainly too many. But a massacre, that's maybe taking it a bit too far. However, the British are going to be so villainized in the whole, all the kind of colonial governments, not just those in Boston and in Massachusetts, but all across the other colonies going further south, are going to be horrified by this and outraged by this. And in newspapers and in propaganda are going to start to be portrayed as tyrants, right? That, hey, they're willing to kill anyone who's standing up for their God-given rights. So anyone who's willing to protest and willing to kind of be in the faces of somebody to hold truth to power, again, they're saying, you know what? They're willing to kill these people. So this really is going to be a work of propaganda that really filters out and fires up a lot of people who are maybe on the fence, maybe even people who are more loyal to the crown and saying, I think maybe people are going too far. A lot of those people now start to sit up and say, oh, wow, look, they massacred these people. Again, 5 people died. Again, 1 person would be enough. 5, yeah, that's obviously unfortunate. It's a tragedy. But to call it a massacre, a little bit disingenuous, especially when the colonists were being so agitated and so hostile towards these British soldiers. But again, it was enough to get more and more people in the colonies fired up. And again, this work of propaganda actually drawn and etched itself by Paul Revere. Here, I got my little Paul Revere bell here. That he's going to make this, and this is one of 2 things he's very famous for. Okay, but again, this picture is going to circulate all throughout the newspapers, all throughout the colonists, saying, hey, look at these British soldiers. Some of them even got a little grim smile on their face as they're shooting into the crowd. So again, this is going to be a very successful work of propaganda, okay? So things are really starting to deteriorate pretty fast here. So the British realize what a problem they have on their hands, and they need to get this situation under control quick. So they're going to try to repeal almost all of those Townshend Acts. So those Townshend Acts I talked about last week that were very restrictive and were kind of holding, taxed lots and lots of stuff. They're trying to pull those back to make sure the colonists are, again, not as angry as maybe they could be. But they did keep a tax on tea to show, well, we're still serious about this. And anyone who doesn't respect this tax on tea is going to face some consequences. So they're still taxing tea, but taking back some of the other taxes, okay? But getting rid of these Townshend Acts, smuggling, which was the whole reason they were put in the first place, to prevent smuggling and to prevent people from paying the taxes, are going to quickly resume. So what was trying to be getting rid of in the past just starts back up again once these acts are gotten rid of and once they're not going to be as respected as they were, okay? So the British are going to start to try to take some of these colonists on trial for anyone who is maybe, violating those previous acts or violating these restrictions on tea. Okay, so the House of Burgesses is going to create and start this kind of whole new thing known as a Committees or committee of correspondence. Again, the House of Burgesses has been officially dissolved, but they're meeting secretly. They're meeting behind closed doors because they say, hey, listen, they're basically looking over their shoulders, making sure there's no spies there, saying, hey, listen, we need to start a communications network with not just between us, but with other colonies. So remember that Albany Plan of Union, that idea that all these colonies need to get together and form this central government? That's going to start to pick up a little bit more steam because behind closed doors, they're secretly saying, hey, listen, we need to be ready for something. We don't know if it's going to be a kind of a skirmish, a battle, a conflict, maybe a full-fledged war, but us colonists need to be ready for something and need to be ready to communicate. Again, they don't have text message. They don't have telephones. Really, it's kind of a back room or back channels of letters and kind of secret spies communicating with one another, okay? Because they're basically all these various people across the colonies from the House of Burgesses, which, again, has been officially dissolved in Virginia, to the Massachusetts Assembly, officially dissolved, but meeting in secret, getting, again, behind closed doors and saying, hey, we need to make sure we're all ready and we're all on the same page. So now secretly, lots of secret letters are being sent all across the colonies between, again, all the colonies are talking to one another, saying, hey, we need to get ready to unite against something that might happen. Okay, so these committees of correspondence starting to crop up and starting to prepare for, hey, we need to be prepared and ready for a united resistance. Okay, so yet another tea act. There's lots of tea acts, right? In 1773 takes place, yet another tax on tea to try to make up debts for the British East India Company, which is kind of the official company for Britain that really owns the tea trade, okay? And what's big about this is it allows the East India Company to sell directly to shopkeepers and get bypass those merchants and smugglers. So all those who were breaking the law, who were making kind of a quick buck on the side and avoiding paying taxes, well, they're saying, well, the company can actually sell to the shopkeepers directly, which makes the merchants and smugglers, many of which are going to be those Sons of Liberty and many of which are going to be those people more hostile towards British control, they're out of luck and they're going to be losing money. So they're going to kind of react angrily to that. So on the very fateful kind of time of October 1773, 1,253 chests of tea are sent by the East India Company to Boston, New York, Philadelphia, and Charlestown, many of the biggest cities across the colonies. So in December of 1773, Boston Harbor, the Boston Tea Party takes place. About 150 men, many of which were members of the Sons of Liberty, so this was kind of an official Sons of Liberty operation here, okay, are going to basically disguise themselves poorly as Native Americans. Everybody knew that it wasn't really Native Americans that did this, but they were trying to say, oh, if they were caught, oh, we're Native Americans, or people saw them from afar, oh, they're Native Americans doing this, not the Sons of Liberty. But that really was not convincing to anybody. Everybody knew who was really behind this. Okay, 150 men snuck onto the ship and chucked all that tea that was sitting there in the Boston Harbor overboard. So that's just money that's just being thrown into the water and is just totally being wasted. And they're doing this as an act of protest, and basically what's becoming more and more closer to an act of war. Okay, so that happens, and naturally the British are going to get pissed off by that. And King George III, you can't really see his picture here because I'm blocking it. This is really his last straw. He's saying, listen, these colonists are not getting in line. They're not paying attention to what I'm telling them to do, and they're being willfully kind of rebellious against me. And so kind of starting on the next lecture, we're going to see how the king's going to react. And again, as you can imagine, is going to get the colonies, specifically Boston, in a lot of trouble, but the colonies in general closer and closer to war, okay? Again, they tried to disguise themselves as Native Americans, but that really didn't work on anybody. Everybody knew who was really behind this, okay? So there's a lot of people that kind of came out for this and knew this was going to happen and are cheering these Sons of Liberty as all this tea is being chucked over. Meanwhile, some of the troops that were seeing it happen didn't really step in because they realized how outnumbered they were. And so they're like, okay, and seeing it happen, and they're like, well, we're just going to tell the king, and the king is, again, as we're going to see, going to take more and more drastic action. Okay, so that does it for kind of the lecture for today. As always, if you have any questions about anything, please let me know and I'll answer them. And yeah, take care.